Welcome to the Book Barn. I'm Lainey, and today we're diving into a fascinating historical thriller. I will be joined by author David R. Stokes to talk about the book, The Hope Not Plot. I really enjoyed this book. David is a Wall Street Journal best-selling author, ghostwriter, broadcaster, and a retired pastor. Here is a short synopsis of his book. As 90-year-old Winston Churchill barely clings to life in January 1965, Great Britain and the world prepares for the funeral of the century. The long-planned grand farewell has a code name, Operation Hope Not. A who's who list of world leaders plan to attend. Why is Lyndon B. Johnson a no-show? Why, indeed. Let me get our author on the phone.
Hello.
Hello, David.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well today. How about yourself?
I'm doing fine. Now, what do I call you?
My name is Lainey.
Lainey. Okay, got it.
Yes, and thank you so much for joining me.
No problem.
The original plan was to have a second host as well. My son was going to join us, but unfortunately, I have a sick granddaughter, so you just get me today.
Boy. How many grandkids do you have?
I have 4.
Cool. I have 7 and 1 great-grandchild, so we're enjoying that season of life.
I love that season as well.
Mm-hmm. Where are you located?
I am located in southeast Kansas. And where are you from?
Well, I'm in Fairfax, Virginia.
Okay. I have family from in that area.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Just outside D.C. Yeah.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've been looking forward to this interview. And before we talk about your own writing, I would really love to know, what kind of books do you personally enjoy reading?
Well, for my own reading, I have my tastes are nonfiction usually. I don't read a lot of fiction, some historical fiction, but biographies, political biographies, also narrative nonfiction, like Eric Larson's books. Boy, those are great. And other authors in that same genre. I've written a couple of books in that genre, as well as some of the fiction that I've written. So those are the kind of books I read. Usually I get my fictional ideas from reading nonfiction.
Nice. Were you always a reader, like even when you were young?
Always. I always told this story when I was a minister, that when I was a young boy, I read a biography of Thomas Edison. And I was really touched by a story that he used to work on a train that went between Ohio and Port Huron, Michigan. And when he'd have a layover, he'd go into the public library and he took a ruler and he'd measure a foot of books. He'd check those books out and he'd read those over the next several days. And then he'd put them back and he'd measure another foot and take them. I never did, I don't think, as many books as he did, but I actually did that a few times. And I've started going to the public library. My goodness, I was in the 1st or 2nd grade, and I think I paid more in library fines than many people pay in taxes, you know.
Oh, my.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But that's, I've always been a reader, yes.
Amazing. We have a book club, and many of our girls do not buy a lot of books. They check them out of the library. So it's so nice that we have them.
Yes, and that's a very good resource. People don't realize how great a resource a public library is, and it really is. And I use it for research as well, too. And with all the computerized stuff and the lending between branches of the library, it's just a great tool for writers and readers.
I agree. Well, I want to talk about your book. The cover art of The Hope Not Plot, I have to say, it is striking. You have Churchill in his signature hat, puffing a cigar. It has shadows and smoke, and the title is bold and a little distressed with not in striking red. I loved it. Honestly, if I were to walk into a bookstore and I would see that cover, I'd want to buy that book. So
Well, that's nice.
how involved were you in that design of the cover? Did you have anything to do with that?
I had an input to the extent that I was given several different options and concepts, I guess is a better word, to look at. And that concept, the image concept of it, was the one that I was drawn to for the reasons similar to what you just described. But it was more of a, A, B, C, D, or E, and I liked B or whatever it was.
Well, it's great. I loved it.
Mm-hmm.
Also, from your book overview, it says that the Hope Not plot is fiction, yet
Right.
I totally found that it is saturated with historical details. Have you always been a history guy?
Oh yeah, that's been my number. I got that from my dad. I was born in '56, and by the time I was 4 or 5 years of age, my dad even had these flashcards where I had to learn the president, like he used to learn multiplication tables and this. I'd learn the presidents of the United States in order.
Nice.
But my dad was a history person, had a PhD in history, so I sort of gleaned that from him, and got my first set of history books from the old AMP store, if people are old enough to remember those. And they were giving out history books with detergent or something. I forget. They used to give promotion. And my dad bought me. They were laden with. They were younger for younger readers, obviously, but they were still very well written. And the foreword to those books was written by the then president, John F. Kennedy, who was also a lover of history.
That's an amazing story. Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
teach fourth grade, and so, we always hope that we inspire kids to enjoy history and enjoy reading, but you got that from your dad. That's very cool.
Yep, did. Yep.
I found myself looking up several things from your book as I was reading.
Right.
I wanted to see what was fact versus fiction. How did you
Right.
begin that research process for that book?
But for one thing, I had a lot of. I've always been a bit of a Churchill buff. I had read. In fact, at one point, and I've downsized since I retired, but at one point I had a library of 7,000 volumes. It's now under 1,000. But and it was really laden with biographies, political biographies, history, and I suppose at one time or another I've had probably 60 to 70 books about Churchill or by Churchill. He wrote a few himself. And so I've always been fascinated. I thought he was a fascinating figure. And so I had a lot of that in my head already. And I always wanted to write a Churchill book, but not just a pure biography, although a lot of it appears there in the Hope Not plot. But I just had, it was sort of an organic thing with me as far as the love of Churchill.
Well, and I absolutely love that you had Dwight D. Eisenhower mentioned in the
Right.
book. I'm a
Right.
Kansan, so he's from Kansas.
There you go. Abilene. Yes. The man
Yes,
from Abilene.
yes. I've
Right.
actually been
Right.
there, went to, go see where he's laid to rest. And
Yep.
so, yeah,
Yep.
I enjoyed that part of it as well.
I actually, a few years ago, developed a bit of an acquaintance with his grandson, David, and his wife, Julie, who is Richard Nixon's daughter. And when I was doing radio interview, I interviewed them, and then I wrote some articles about him and talked to him a little bit about writing and so forth. So, yeah, big Eisenhower fan, overlooked president, by the way.
I absolutely read about him to my class because, well, during January, we have to celebrate Kansas history.
Right, there you go.
So
There
I
you
love
go.
that. What was the most surprising, verified historical detail that you put into the book or uncovered for the book? What surprised you when you were researching?
Well, I think it was the trigger to the whole book itself. And, there's an old, the old Sherlock Holmes question, why did the dog not bark? I've written books where especially with fiction, I did that with a book called The Camelot's Cousin, where I looked at something that either happened or didn't happen or should have happened, and why didn't it happen? In this case, I was reading about Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson. He had a landslide victory after he became president. with Kennedy's assassination. He was elected by this monstrous landslide in 64. Then he was inaugurated in his own right in January of 65, and that was within days of Churchill's funeral. And yet, he did not go to Churchill's funeral, although like 100 world leaders were going to be there converging on London. I thought that was rather odd. Why didn't Lyndon Johnson go? Now, the official reason was he had a cold, but I took that and went through a looking glass and invented something else, a little more sinister. The readers will have to get the book to figure that out. Why did Lyndon Johnson not go? But that was the trigger for it. And then everything else sort of flowed from that through the looking glass, down the rabbit hole, whatever you want to call it, kind of experience.
I thought that part of it was genius. And of course, we don't want to give spoilers. We want everyone to grab their copy. But fascinating. The whole, because I was Googling, like, what? Did he really not go? And he did not.
And he didn't send his vice president, Hubert Humphrey. I think Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, was the head of the delegation. And even Eisenhower didn't go because Johnson wanted him to go. Eisenhower was invited by the Queen and also by the BBC to do commentary on the funeral. But he was sort of an official representative. He had that wartime relationship with Churchill, when he was the general of D-Day and all that stuff.
Yes. Well, as I was Googling these facts, one of them that you wrote about that I thought was just awesome was the fact that Churchill wrote all of his own speeches.
Right.
I don't think that we've probably had a president since that does that.
Nixon did a lot of that, although he had speechwriters, but not to the extent that Churchill did. And Churchill labored over it. He really did. But he was also a writer. He had been writing since before the turn of the 20th century. I mean, he was famous as a writer, and he had already written so many books, even before he became prime minister, books about the First World War. Then, of course, he went on to write the epic history of the Second World War. But so he was a writer. Now, it's interesting. His writing style is he used dictation. And I have never been able to master that. I've thought that could be such a time saver, but certain people have certain skills. But he used to pace and dictate, usually to a secretary, always to a secretary, and then those would be transcribed, and then he would shape the rest of the verbiage, from that. But sure. Yeah, he was prolific. So when he wrote his speeches, he first dictated them, and then he went back and he really agonized over every phrase, every word. So when you hear these great, blood, toils, tears, and sweat, and we shall fight them on the beaches, and never have in the history of man have so many owed so much to so few. These were phrases that were uniquely his, and that's why the great Edward R. Murrow famously said that it was Churchill who mobilized the English language and sent it into battle.
Wow. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, and then going back to Lyndon B. Johnson, I did look up the fact that he had a high attendance rate at his inauguration.
Oh, yeah.
From what I could find, the only person that has brought in more people would be Barack Obama. But
I think that's true, yeah.
But Lyndon B. Johnson, 1.2 million people. That's a lot of people.
Right. And that was, the presidents have always, talked about crowd sizes. We hear that so much,
right.
in the news. But Johnson, that was important to Johnson. I think Johnson, who had a lot of great gifts, was also a very insecure man in some ways, and always in the shadow of John F. Kennedy. And I think that those things were really important to him. But it was well attended. I mean, this is the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination, the country coming back together, and so it's an important moment. And that really was I think the apex of LBJ's career. Of course, by that time we didn't fully know to the extent of it, getting mired down in Vietnam. This was a president who had so many great ideas for defeating poverty and taking care of the poor, civil rights, other things that he did that I think make him a great president. But then that was undone by the quagmire that was Vietnam.
Hmm.
Presidents have had a hard time learning the lesson that wars don't really help them.
I agree. I do.
Hmm. Hmm.
I also, when I was Googling facts, was looking up Lady Bird Johnson's name because that's a
Hmm.
unique
Hmm.
name. And I thought that
Hmm.
was kind of fun that that was a childhood
Yeah,
nickname,
Claudia, I think Claudia was her name really, but yeah, Lady Bird. He called her Bird.
which
Yeah.
is really sweet.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I found Harvey King's story to be really cool.
Yeah, he's based on a real life spy named William King Harvey, who was actually a real life spy. People can find out about him, but I modeled that character not so loosely. I mean, it's very clear who that is in my thinking
Right.
for this, and I think I characterized him pretty correct. He was himself a controversial figure. It was said that Ian Fleming used him as one of the models for James Bond, even though King would have looked William King Harvey or Harvey King in my manifestation would have looked nothing like Sean Connery,
Yes.
right?
Right. Well, Winston Churchill, he is often depicted as a larger than life figure. What
Right.
specific, intimate, or human side of him were you hoping to highlight in the book?
I think one of the things that's often it's been written about, but people don't think about it, is his relationship with Clementine, Clemmy, as he called it, his wife. I think that was a really important part. She was not only a support to him, she also tempered him at times. You know, it's important that leaders have people in their lives who can sort of keep them from going beyond the guardrails. And when a leader doesn't have that, and I will name no names here, things can really go badly. You need people in your life to say, you can't say that, you can't do that, you can't go there. And Clemmy was somebody in his life that way. So I talked about that somewhat. But also, I think he was just, like you say, larger than life. And he was, I think, the greatest man of the 20th century by far because of what he accomplished. The other thing was that, you know, he was a down and out politician just 2 or 3 years before he became prime minister. He had held every major office, but he was regarded as a has-been, a relic, a dinosaur, so to speak. And yet the times called upon him. And then, as soon as the war was over, the public moved on. It's almost like they didn't fully appreciate what he did. He was the right man in the right place at the right time.
You've kind of inspired me to read more about him, honestly.
Well, please do. That's never going to be wasted time. And I would recommend you read the William Manchester biographies of him, which Manchester wrote the first two, and then his research was written by another guy after Manchester died for the third one. But the one that's the best is the one in the middle. It's called Alone, and it starts in 1940, and it's in the 30s and going into the 40s. It's about his wilderness years. Fantastic book, fantastic period, fantastic writer.
I will have to pick that up. Thank you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, what do you hope readers take with them after reading The Hope Not Plot?
Well, you know, we these days, and for good or for ill, and I think it's not always a positive thing, I always wonder, are we hearing the real story? You know, what really happened? What was the real reason? I mean, it seems like almost every day a politician will say, this didn't happen, and then it did, or this
Hmm.
did happen, and then it didn't. And so that's always been there. I think some of the best historical fiction is finding those weak spots, those vulnerable spots, and then poking them a little bit to see what the imagination will create. Uh, but I think when it comes to historical fiction, I would say historical is capitalized, fiction is lowercase. And a lot of historical fiction, and this is a matter of taste. This is not a criticism, is fiction that has some history in it. When I've written historical fiction, I really wanted to get the history as good as possible, as right as possible, and as much as possible included in the book. So I would hope, well, I hope it's a fun story to read, an interesting story, and the thriller elements and the fictitious elements and the fictitious characters. I would hope that somebody comes away with it also with a little bit greater knowledge of who Churchill was and what he accomplished, and who Johnson was, and some of these other characters. Kim Philby appears in the book, for instance, as a famous spy.
It did all those things for me.
Mm-hmm.
I had it downloaded on my phone, and I don't typically read books off of my phone, but it did not take long for me. I didn't want to put it down, and I did learn a lot, and I was also very entertained. So well done.
Good. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate that, Lainey.
What's one question that you wish that interviewers would ask you?
One question interviewers would ask me. You've done a good interview here. I don't really have anything that pops off the top of my head. I think that I love talking about my research, and I love talking about how I get to a particular spot. So I hate to say this, but the well comes up dry on that because you've done such a great job.
Oh, well, thank you. Are you working on anything right now?
Yes, I am actually. I grew up in the Detroit, Michigan area, and always heard these stories about the Ford Motor Company and Henry Ford, who himself was a really interesting character. But I found, and I also remember hearing about this as a kid, he had an assistant who was really sort of like a Rasputin kind of character in the Ford Motor Company. His name was Harry Bennett, and I'm writing a book about Harry Bennett, who was basically Henry Ford's henchman. He was his fixer. He was his agent provocateur. He was the man he sent to get things done, and he was the man that Henry Ford wanted to take over the company after he was gone. It didn't work out that way, but a fascinating character. And so this is against the backdrop of the 1920s, the 1930s, and even into World War II. That's what I'm working on now. I also, going back to Lyndon Johnson for a moment, have a book that I've been noodling on for years with the working title, Nixon and Johnson in the Shadow of JFK. These two men, Nixon and Johnson, you don't often see them together, but I was at something one time with David and Julie Eisenhower at the National Archives, and there was also one of Lyndon Johnson's daughters, Linda Bird, and the former governor of Virginia, Robb, and they were there, and they were all talking, and I was standing a few feet away, and I was just observing this conversation and thought, here are kids of two presidents. I began to research this. I actually wrote an article about it for the Nixon Foundation called LBJ and Nixon, an Overlooked Relationship. I think somebody can Google it, I guess. And so I've sort of gone into that relationship between these. They weren't good friends, but they were similar, and they had this one thing in common. They both had this odd relationship with John F. Kennedy, who was gone, and his ghost sort of haunted them, and his shadow sort of haunted them, and it sort of defined how they were. And when it comes to the period of time from 1964 to 1974, those were the dominant political figures in America. So that's something I haven't figured out how it works, but that's also something I'm working on.
Well, when one of those pieces is completed, please remember the book barn. We would love to talk about it.
I will, and I thank you very much.
David, I can't thank you enough. You've just been a fun guest to talk to, and I wish you the best of luck.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Lainey. And like I say, people can find out about my books at Amazon. David R. Stokes, put the R in there, or David R. Stokes author on Facebook, and davidrastokes.com on the web. But just love that people pick up my reading and read it and think it through and chew on it. And thank you so much for doing all of those.
Absolutely. I can't wait to read another one.
Okay.
All right.
Stay tuned.
Bye.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
David takes his readers on quite a historical journey. I learned a lot from this book. It's so saturated in facts that the fiction felt plausible. Here's a couple of lines I highlighted from the book. This one is very thought-provoking. I have long been intrigued by those moments from the past when something that should have happened didn't, the what-ifs and why didn'ts of history. And my favorite quote, at first, there were only murmurs and a few pointing fingers, but soon the name was on many lips and was passed from hushed voice to hushed voice. Parents telling children who the general was and how important he had been to Winston Churchill and to the world that they were inheriting. And of course, that was about Dwight D. Eisenhower. Our children and grandchildren are inheriting what we leave behind, so let's give them something they can be proud of. I recommend this book to anyone who enjoys historical fiction or nonfiction. Thanks for joining. Until next time, I'm Lainey, and keep those bookmarks bouncing.